So this year has been a roller coaster for all of us, especially for small businesses. You've had to deal with shifting guidelines. You've had to invent new products, come up with new ways to make money, and some of you just completely changed the way you work and do business. Our Small Business Update program began during the pandemic as a way to help small businesses outside of Washington, D.C. make sense of the constantly changing policies and emergency measures that were taking place during the pandemic. That was a PPP program, tax breaks for those impacted by COVID, vaccine mandates, and we're still talking about all of those things every day. Over the course of the year, we hosted thousands of guests virtually, and top chamber and government officials answered their questions in real time. But today marks a shift in our series as we are witnessing a rebuilding of the economy and a new startup boom that is happening in the wake of the pandemic, and it's super exciting for us. So today, to talk about all of that with me is Neil Bradley, Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer, and Head of Strategic Advocacy for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Jeanette. Great to be with you again.
It's great to be with you too. I feel it's a different feeling, a new energy for us than during the pandemic, so it's exciting. So let's start by talking about this startup boom. Just like, what are we seeing at the chamber in terms of what's happening there?
Well, this may be the best good news story of 2020 and 2021 that virtually no one has heard of. So let's jump into some raw numbers. Last year, 4.3 million new businesses started all across the United States. In some states, we saw new business starts at 10, 15, 20% over the year before. Nationally, a 24.6% increase in the number of new businesses started. And we broke what was an awful trend line that we were on. If you go back 15 years to 2005, that's the last time that new business starts were up double-digit percentages. And so we basically had a flat line in the United States of kind of new businesses. We had a few years where business deaths were actually larger than new business births. And we blew that away in the last year, and we're looking at trend lines that are going to continue with new business starts from people in their prime working years, minorities, veterans, all outpacing prior records in terms of new business creation.
It's so crazy that I could not have anticipated that, and maybe, do we know why? What is driving this?
Well, there are skeptics out there who say, well, this was a new business creation by necessity. And there's some truth to that, though I think the critics are overselling it. If you look back, and there's been some survey work done of individuals who started their business in 2020, and about 30% were unemployed at the time that they started their business. That is higher than usual, but still it's only 30%. You still have people who are entrepreneurs by choice, who actually saw opportunity in the pandemic and seized it. And I think even when we're talking about those individuals who went from prior employment to unemployment to owning their own business, this was probably a great unlocking event. It is, everyone who's listening here who started a business knows, it's a big leap of faith, right? Like, you're taking a real chance. And all of a sudden, we had a moment in which lots of people were empowered to take that chance. And we unlocked and unleashed a lot of new entrepreneurs on the scene. I think that's what deserves credit for this new business start boom. And the thing I'm most excited about it is the number of these new small businesses who are likely to grow to be bigger small businesses and then mid-sized businesses is also estimated to be at record levels.
So are there particular industries where we're seeing more growth than others? I mean, I'm sure there are.
There are. The good news is that the growth is across the board. It's across every industrial sector. Interestingly, one of the biggest growths was in the not classified sector, meaning that these are people who are starting businesses that actually may not fit into one of our classic traditional definitions, which means they may be the real entrepreneurs and the innovators who are creating something new. We think about tech companies that were started in a garage. we probably didn't know how to classify them either. And now they're some of the biggest companies in the world. But when we look at the traditional segments, retail had big growth, as did transportation and warehousing. And so you heard Administrator Guzman talking about reaching customers online. I think that's a lot of what's going on here. We have new small businesses. It used to be if you opened a retail store, it mattered how big the market was in your hometown, right? How many people would pass by, on Main Street. Today, the world is your Main Street. With the right technology and the right strategy, you can reach consumers around the world. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing this explosion in retail and transportation and warehousing.
So interesting. Okay, so for people in our audience today who are starting new businesses, can you just touch on whether there are particular government programs they could be taking advantage of? We talked so much about programs related to COVID, but what kind of things are there for new businesses?
Yeah, I would think about programs in kind of three buckets. The first is the technical assistance, and you heard Administrator Guzman talking about this as well. There are programs that the Small Business Administration provides. There are programs likely in your local community supported by the Small Business Administration. These are what they call incubator programs. There's ones for small businesses in general, but there's also one specifically made for manufacturers that can help you kind of navigate some of the practical issues of starting up a business. Of course, it's not government, but obviously the co-platform does this day in and day out. I think the second bucket where you can look to government is some of that capital assistance, the traditional loans. So the SBA administers loans outside of the pandemic for small businesses. These are often lower interest loans to help entrepreneurs access capital. And if you've started your business and you're looking to expand, that's one place to go. The third bucket that maybe is often overlooked is thinking about government as a customer. And so, government at the federal level, the state level, all the way down to your local school district, depending on what business you're in, they may be the largest consumer in your area. And almost all levels of government have set aside programs for small businesses. So figure out if you're selling something or producing something or providing a service that government uses. And if you're a small business, try to get in on that contractor lane and let the government be one of your customers.
That's actually really good advice that a lot of people probably haven't thought of. But speaking of COVID programs, I do think we should do just a very quick lightning round talking about, I know that a lot of them have expired, but could you just go over what does remain in terms of assistance from the government for small businesses?
Sure, we are on the tail end of this. And so let me start quickly with what's no longer open. The PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, the restaurant revitalization grants, the shuttered venue grants. Those programs have all come to a conclusion. Economic injury disaster loans. This is an expanded version of loans that the SBA provides. Those still exist. And so it's a loan, but it's a loan on very favorable terms that a small business can look at. And of course, we still have the employee retention tax credit. We just closed out the third quarter. If you didn't claim the employee retention tax credit for the third quarter, you should look to see if you're eligible. CO has a guide for small businesses where you can help figure out if you're eligible. Not every small business is eligible. You have to have revenue that's down by 20% or more in a quarter. But if you do, you can get a sizable tax credit to help offset your wage costs for your employees. That is scheduled to expire at the end of this calendar year, though it's possible that Congress may terminate it a little bit earlier.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about hiring, which we know is a challenge for everyone. So we're seeing it across every industry. And now with the holidays, we know that it's going to be even more of a challenge because people are trying to hire seasonal workers. What kind of insights does the chamber have into why this is happening, when things might improve? And I would ask you, do you think that this startup boom is related to it at all? Do you think people who would have gone back to work have started their own businesses?
Yeah, so let's start at the macro level, the big numbers. This is supply and demand kind of 101 here. And the supply is what we call our labor force. That's all the people who are working or who are looking for work. That labor force is 3 million people smaller today than it was in February of last year, right before the pandemic. So businesses are trying to hire out of a much smaller pool today. And so if you think back to right before the pandemic, we had a really tight labor market then. Employers were already reporting difficulty filling open jobs, and that's only gotten worse because of the pandemic and this smaller workforce. Jeanette, you're right to point out the connection between small business starts and some of this. We actually surveyed the previously employed who had not gone to work for someone else. So people who were employees of another business before the pandemic, but as of the spring of this year, weren't working for someone else. And we asked them, what are you doing? And about 15 to 20% said, hey, they had started their own business, or they were doing gig work, contractor work. There was another group of them, about the same number, who had retired early. They were close to retirement age. They figured out they had the financial wherewithal, and they retired early. So that's all adding to and kind of complicating this very tight labor market, in addition to immigration restrictions and a whole host of other things that are contributing to the difficulty employers have in filling those open jobs.
Just so the smaller number that you referenced, just that the pool being smaller, what is the reason for that? Is it the reasons you just listed, like immigration issues?
It's those reasons I just listed. There are other reasons too. You have quite a few working parents, in particular mothers, who can't access affordable childcare. The kids may be back in school, but because of quarantine requirements and other things, it's very unpredictable. And so that's preventing a lot of those working parents from re-entering the workforce. It's also true that the level of government aid and benefits that flowed into people's bank accounts hit historic records. Americans are sitting on over $2 trillion of excess savings. And so that means some people don't feel the pressure that they need to work in order to kind of make ends meet at the moment. And so all of these are kind of factors that are contributing to the problem.
So one of the things you get to do in your role is just talk to lots and lots of businesses, as do I. Do you have any patterns you're seeing that are emerging in terms of best practices for businesses that are trying to hire in this market?
Yeah, we are seeing some things, and we're seeing an exploration of kind of new opportunities. So some businesses have the ability to offer flexible work arrangements. We know that is highly attractive to people, especially those who have not yet re-entered the workforce. And so thinking about whether your small business could accommodate flexible work arrangements doesn't mean working remote all the time, but maybe flex days when employees can work remote. That seems to be attractive. Earlier, as we were in the recovery, we saw hiring bonuses. Our own polling of the unemployed confirmed that a hiring bonus was one of the most effective ways to kind of seal the deal with a potential employee and bringing them back. We're talking to employers now who are also thinking about what they can do beyond traditional compensation. So, for example, I mentioned a moment ago, lack of access to affordable childcare. Well, one of the things that the government provides for employers is actually a tax credit for your expenses if you're helping your employees either find childcare or you're helping to subsidize or provide that childcare, either on site or more likely through an independent childcare provider. Think about the local childcare facility in your neighborhood. And you can get up to a 25% tax credit for that. And so some small businesses are thinking, I may not end up competing on wages. What I might want to compete on is helping my potential employees get childcare, or maybe I want to do that with my existing employees to keep them engaged. The same is true with student debt. One of the provisions that we didn't talk about much, but that was enacted as part of the early pandemic bills was the ability of an employer to pay up to $5,250 a year of an employee's student loans. So think about your employee's student loan balances. And by the way, there are a lot of employees who maybe didn't complete college, but still have student loan debt. You can help pay off that student loan debt and obviously deduct that as a business expense, just like you would as wages. But for the employee, it doesn't count as income. So they don't have to pay taxes on it. So all of a sudden you can have a conversation with your employees and say, hey, maybe rather than that wage increase, I'm going to offer a student loan repayment benefit and you don't have to pay taxes on that. And that's some of the creative things that we see employers doing to really meet potential employees where they are.
I would be very surprised if many businesses realized that they could help pay student debt and that it would count as a business expense. That's a really, really useful piece of information.
And more importantly for your employee, they don't have to pay taxes on
Right,
it.
and it doesn't count as income. That's really an interesting opportunity. Before I go to my last question for you, Neil, I just want to tell the audience that you should be putting your questions for Neil in the chat now because I'm going to go to them in a second. So thinking ahead, Neil, just like what is on your radar more broadly that small businesses just need to be thinking about? What kind of trends are you seeing? What kind of concerns do you have that they should be aware of?
Well, we've talked about one of the biggest concerns already, and that's workforce. I think the second biggest concern is supply chain. We obviously see that already impacting a number of small businesses. At the U.S. Chamber, one of the things that we're working on is to try to unclog some of these kinks in the supply chain and working with some of the nation's biggest businesses to do that, because we know if they help unclog the system, that's also going to unclog it for small businesses who can be particularly affected by these backlogs at the ports and the inability to get products to the new retail store that they've opened during the pandemic. I think the big trend we're also looking for is how work changes going forward. So, we're doing this event digitally. We continue to see growth in this digital world where people are working hybrid, partially in person, partially remotely. That also accretes to things around technology and automation that can help small businesses in particular deal with some of the increased costs of labor. And so when I think about the future, I think it's a little bit about how we take advantage of the opportunities the pandemic unlocked with virtual world and how you use that to achieve efficiencies that can help you control costs, particularly in a world in which labor costs are going up so quickly.
Let's just talk about vaccine mandates for a second. It's such a tricky subject. We have small businesses in the audience who probably would like their employees to be vaccinated because it would maybe be helpful to them in terms of getting back to normal, but they're not required to be vaccinated. And so can you just say, what are you seeing in terms of best practices among businesses who are not mandating it, but who are trying to encourage it?
Well, I think the single best practice we see kind of across the board is employer engagement with their employees, simply talking to their employees, understanding where they're living, having a sense of the level of vaccinations that exist in your workforce. Is it low? Is it high? Is it comparable to your area or to people in your industry? Vaccination rates vary considerably by industry at the current moment. And then understanding, particularly for smaller employers, because you have such a personal connection to your employees, understanding what's on their mind, and if they're not vaccinated, why not? And is there something that employers can do to help with that? Some employers have brought in medical experts because the real issue was unanswered questions that employees had. Employers have helped facilitate getting those questions answered. For others, it's, I just can't get to a place to get vaccinated. It's the stickiness of getting it done, particularly now that we have much fewer mass vaccination sites. And so employers just making it easier for their employees to go get vaccinated. So having those conversations, understanding where your employees are living is kind of the best way to help more people get vaccinated and ultimately to return to normal.
That's great. Let's go to a couple audience questions. This person asks, like, do we just have any estimate on how long this labor market is going to remain the way it is?
Well, it's going to get better, but it's going to be tight for a really long time. I mentioned earlier that the labor market was tight kind of pre-pandemic, and this exacerbated it. This is a demographic question, and the truth is that our demographics are moving kind of in the wrong direction. That our prime working age population relative to our overall population is shrinking. It's not growing as fast as we need it to grow to continue to meet the demands that our economy has. That's especially true if you back out immigration. And so, if we don't have the opportunity to really right size our immigration levels, legal immigration levels, that's going to continue to put pressure on the supply of workers. So right now, it's worse than it's ever been, and that's going to ease somewhat, but we're not anytime soon getting to a point in which we're going to have lots of slack in the labor force.
Yeah. This person asks, are there solutions being discussed in DC to address this workforce crisis?
There are. They're not getting near the attention that they deserve to get. So we've suggested that policymakers focus on a couple key areas. One is we need to address the child care affordability issue. And so making sure that that's not a barrier for working parents who want to return to work, we can do something to address that. For some people, there's a skills gap. The job that they used to have is never coming back. They're looking for a job in a new industry, and it requires different skill sets. And so rapid employment-based job training programs where we're getting people skills for jobs that are open today is really important. And the government is starting to make investments in that, but they can do a lot more to make sure that we're training people for jobs that are available for them today. We've called on lawmakers to double the level of legal immigration for employment purposes, the number of people coming to this country to take jobs. And so we're making slow kind of progress there. We should be moving much faster. So those are all things that we kind of have to do, along with about a dozen others to begin addressing this problem.
Sure. I don't know if you'll know this. This person asked about the Community Navigator pilot program. Do you know what that is?
It could. I don't know if they're asking about the program at the SBA.
Yeah.
That Mr. Guzman was talking about.
They say, is the Community Navigator pilot program still in development? In seeking help for the submission in July, my local SBA were unaware of the program. So yeah, I think that, yes, I think they're saying, is this really a thing yet, or is it still in development?
Well, it's a thing and still in development. This is the classic build the plane as you fly it. And so the government is, and in particular the SBA, is trying to stand up these Navigator programs to really connect small businesses, particularly underserved small businesses and underserved communities with the programs that the government offers. And so they're beginning to stand that up. But I would not be surprised at all that if you reach out to a local office, they didn't have a lot of information yet at this moment.
Can people go to the main SBA site for that?
You could go to the main SBA site. Obviously, it's a community navigator, so ultimately it's going to be in the community. So I think I would still try, if the local SBA office didn't, try the regional SBA office. So there are 9 regions across the country. Talk to them, reach out and find your region and call them. That may be a good first step. If you're still having trouble, reach out to us. And so we're happy to help. We have a small business team, obviously, here at the U.S. Chamber, and we'd be happy to help make those connections.
In the last couple of minutes that we have, I wanted to ask you about resilience. I know over the last year, we've heard so much about grit, and I think resilience is the new grit. And as the editor of Co, I know what people read, right? And I know that our stories about how to protect yourself against a cyber attack, or how to write an emergency preparedness plan. They're our least popular stories, because the truth is no one has time to think about those things when they're running their day-to-day business, but they're also the most important things. So between weather and cyber attacks and supply chain problems, resilience is really a huge issue for small businesses, and one that they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to think about. So in your world, what are you seeing in terms of resilience and efforts to make small businesses more resilient, and what's working for people?
Well, Jeanette, I think it's the things that you talked about, right? And I think you're right. Oftentimes we think about it as, that's not likely to happen to me, and spending time today amidst everything else I have to do to plan for it doesn't seem like a good use of time. But what we do see is that businesses who do carve out time for that are the ones who are most likely to survive over the long term. Both because they may end up having a cyber attack or a supply chain disruption that fundamentally upends their business, but also because the act of preparing for those things, of being resilient, gives you skills and insights that you can employ when the truly unexpected thing happens, right? And so, I think that's a lot of kind of the need for preparedness there. I actually just recently read a great story about some of America's largest companies today, who 2 decades ago were literally in a garage or on one street corner. And the author was commenting that one of the through lines across them all is that they all almost failed, like that they were on the cusp of going out of existence, and they somehow had the resiliency to bounce back from that to become major multi-billion-dollar kind of organizations. And so I just think, as painful as it is sometimes, as distracting as it is, we just have to make the time to do that preparation and preparing in order to be resilient. And so if I were giving advice today, I'd spend a lot of time being resilient. If you have any exposure on the cyber side, being resilient there, because it's an attack that not a lot of people are prepared for, and it's an attack that's more and more often occurring against small businesses.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today, Neil. We really appreciate it. Thank you to the audience for joining us.